Charles Dixon stood still, his posture calm and unyielding as he faced Officer Danny Kirkland. The street was quiet, the faint rustle of leaves the only sound accompanying the tense moment. The glow from the nearby street lamp cast long shadows across the sidewalk, accentuating Kirkland's rigid stance. "Evening, officer," Charles said, his voice steady but polite. Kirkland's eyes narrowed slightly. "You live around here?" he asked, his tone brusque. Charles nodded, suppressing the flicker of irritation that threatened to rise. "Been living here for over 4 decades. These streets are as familiar to me as my own front porch." Kirkland's expression didn't soften. "Mind telling me where you're headed?" "Just taking a walk, same as I do most evenings," Charles replied. "Good for the soul, you know." Kirkland's posture remained tense. "We've had some reports about suspicious activity in the area." Charles raised an eyebrow, keeping his composure. "Suspicious, huh? And I look suspicious to you?" The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, but his demeanor remained guarded. "Just doing my job, sir." Charles nodded slowly. "I respect that. Spent over 30 years doing the same job, walking these streets as an officer myself." He let the weight of his words settle. "The badge isn't just about authority, son. It's about service, and knowing who you're serving." Kirkland blinked, caught off guard by the revelation. "You were on the force?" "That's right," Charles confirmed. "Retired now. But some lessons stick with you, like treating people with dignity until they give you a real reason not to." The silence between them was thick with unspoken thoughts. Charles could see the gears turning in Kirkland's mind. The arrogance of a rookie officer faced with the wisdom of a veteran wasn't an unfamiliar dynamic to Charles. "Look, I appreciate you doing your job," Charles said, softening his tone just slightly. "But let me offer you some advice. Seeing people as threats first isn't going to make you a better cop. It'll just make you isolated." Kirkland's expression faltered for a moment, replaced by something closer to reflection. "Noted," he said gruffly, though the edge in his voice had dulled. Charles gave him a curt nod. "Stay safe out here. It's a tough world, but it's easier when folks know you're on their side." With that, Charles turned and resumed his walk, his steps measured and steady. He didn't look back, trusting that his words had left an impression. Behind him, Kirkland remained by the cruiser, his stance less rigid now, as though the weight of Charles's wisdom had settled onto his shoulders. Charles smiled faintly as he continued down the street. Even after retirement, it seemed his role as a mentor and peacemaker hadn't ended, and that, he thought, was just fine. Charles held his ground, his expression unwavering despite the tension that crackled between them. The quiet evening seemed to shrink around the encounter, the hum of distant traffic fading into the background. "Now what?" Charles asked evenly, his voice calm but edged with authority. Kirkland's jaw tightened. "Now I need you to cooperate," he said, the words biting. "This isn't up for debate." Charles exhaled slowly, the years of dealing with tense situations guiding his response. "Son, I was wearing a badge when you were still figuring out how to ride a bike," he said, his voice low but firm. "I know how these things go. You don't want this to escalate, and neither do I." Kirkland faltered for a split second, surprise flickering across his face. "You were on the force?" he asked, suspicion mingling with curiosity. 30 years, Charles confirmed. "Walked these very streets, keeping them safe. And let me tell you something, respect goes a long way. You start from a place of trust, not suspicion." Kirkland's posture remained tense, but doubt crept into his eyes. "You should have said something earlier," he muttered, though the defensiveness in his tone was fading. Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe, but maybe you should have asked differently." His gaze softened just slightly. "I get it. You're trying to do your job." but the way you do it matters. People remember how you make them feel, officer. Kirkland shifted awkwardly, his bravado slipping. Look, I didn't mean any disrespect, he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Charles allowed a faint smile. It's not about me, son. It's about what kind of officer you want to be. You don't need to prove yourself by picking fights with folks just living their lives. The badge is heavier than that. Kirkland looked down for a moment, as though weighing Charles's words. Yeah, maybe you're right, he admitted grudgingly. I know I am, Charles said, his voice lighter now. Stay safe out here. And remember, these streets belong to all of us. He turned to continue his walk, the encounter diffusing into something more reflective than confrontational. As Charles strode away, the tension dissolved into the cool night air. He hoped Kirkland would take the lesson to heart, but whether he did or not was out of Charles's hands. What mattered was that he had stood his ground with dignity, offering wisdom instead of confrontation. Behind him, Kirkland remained by the cruiser, his posture less rigid, as though carrying the weight of a conversation that might just shape the officer he would become. Kirkland's grip was tense, his hand pressing into Charles's shoulder like a vice. But Charles didn't flinch. His voice was low and steady, carrying the weight of years spent diffusing far worse situations. Let go of me, he repeated, each word deliberate. There was a moment of stillness, the city itself seeming to pause. The onlookers across the street froze, their faces taut with concern. Charles's years as an officer had taught him that such moments could either escalate into chaos or dissolve into clarity, and the choice lay in how you handled the next move. Kirkland hesitated, his bravado flickering with uncertainty. Charles sensed it, the subtle crack in the young officer's armor. You're better than this, Charles said quietly. Or at least I hope you are. Kirkland's sneer faltered. What the hell are you talking about? Charles didn't break eye contact. I'm talking about that badge on your chest. It's supposed to stand for something bigger than ego and control. I wore one just like it for 30 years, and I never had to put my hands on someone who wasn't a threat. Kirkland's hand twitched, then slowly released its grip. He stepped back, his jaw clenched, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Charles adjusted his shoulder calmly, his voice still measured but firm. You think people respect you because you're tough? They don't. Respect is earned through integrity, not intimidation. Kirkland looked away, his bravado unraveling under the weight of truth. The silence stretched between them until Kirkland muttered, Maybe I got carried away. Charles nodded, offering a sliver of grace. We all have our moments, but learn from this one, officer. Don't let it define you. Kirkland's face softened just slightly, the edge in his expression dulling. He looked like a man unsure of where to go next. Charles stepped back, his voice calm but resolute. Tonight, I'll keep walking, but next time, ask yourself if you're part of the solution or part of the problem. Without waiting for a response, Charles turned and resumed his walk, his stride steady, carrying with it the dignity that Kirkland couldn't take from him. Behind him, Kirkland stood rooted in place, his hand absently brushing the badge on his chest. The streetlight flickered overhead, casting long shadows as the young officer absorbed the lesson that had just been handed to him. The onlookers began to disperse, their murmurs fading into the night. Charles knew this wasn't just about one confrontation. It was about a seed planted. Whether it would grow was up to Kirkland, but for now, Charles walked on, knowing he had done what he could. The gravity of Charles's words hung heavy between them, the street now a hushed theater, with dozens of witnesses. Phones captured every angle of the confrontation, their cameras reflecting the truth Kirkland couldn't escape. The defiant smirk on Kirkland's face was beginning to crack under the weight of public scrutiny. You really want this to be your legacy? Charles asked, his voice steady but resolute. A man who let ego get in the way of justice? Kirkland's jaw tightened. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as his bravado clashed with reality. The badge on his chest gleamed under the streetlight, a symbol that now felt as heavy as the eyes fixed on him. Charles kept his composure, leaning into decades of experience. I'm giving you a choice, Kirkland. You can walk away, learn from this, and become a better officer. Or you can double down and let this moment define your career. Kirkland's eyes flicked toward the growing crowd, the whisper of onlookers turning into a low buzz. He knew what Charles was saying was true. The videos being recorded now wouldn't disappear. They'd spread, and his actions would be judged far beyond this street corner. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft hum of the city. Kirkland exhaled sharply, his sneer fading into something closer to regret. You're right, Kirkland muttered, though his pride kept him from looking directly at Charles. He faltered, unsure how to finish the sentence. Charles nodded slightly, offering a path forward without humiliation. It takes more strength to own up to a mistake than to pretend it never happened. You're young, Kirkland. Don't let one moment ruin everything. Kirkland's shoulders sagged as he finally stepped back. The weight of ego lifted just enough for reason to break through. Yeah, he admitted quietly. Maybe I was out of line. Charles's expression softened just a fraction. Apology isn't just words, it's action. Show people you're better than this. Kirkland glanced at the crowd, then back at Charles. I'll figure it out, he said, his tone less confrontational. You should, Charles said calmly. And remember, you're not alone. Learn from those who've walked this path before you. As the tension broke, the onlookers began to disperse, conversations fading back into the rhythm of the city. Kirkland nodded stiffly, his face red with a mix of embarrassment and reflection. Charles watched him walk back to his cruiser, his footsteps heavy but measured. The lesson might take time to sink in, but the seed had been planted. As Charles turned to continue his walk, a few people approached him, offering quiet words of support. He acknowledged them with a nod, but didn't linger. Tonight had been about more than just a confrontation. It was about accountability, restraint, and setting an example. The streetlights flickered softly as Charles walked on, carrying with him the quiet strength of a man who knew that dignity and wisdom would always outweigh anger. And tonight, he hoped that message had taken root where it mattered most. The air thickened with renewed tension as Kirkland and his backup approached. Conversations among the lingering crowd hushed, replaced by the weight of expectation. Eyes flickered between Charles and the officers, bracing for what might come next. Charles's heart remained steady, though he knew the gravity of the situation. His years as an officer had taught him to read body language, and Kirkland's was written in bold letters, ego wounded, looking for vindication. The two younger officers, though visibly stern, showed signs of unease. Their glances flicked toward Kirkland, unsure whether this was a situation they should even be involved in. That's him, Kirkland said sharply, pointing at Charles. Refused a lawful order and resisted when I tried to detain him. The absurdity of the claim hung in the air like smoke. Charles took a breath, keeping his voice calm but firm. I suggest you think carefully about what you're saying, Officer Kirkland, he said, projecting authority without aggression. We both know there's nothing lawful about what just happened. The younger officers hesitated. One of them, with sandy blonde hair and a nervous glance, stepped forward slightly. Sir, he said cautiously, addressing Charles, can we talk for a minute away from the crowd? Charles appreciated the attempt at de-escalation but knew better than to leave the public eye. I have nothing to hide, he said. We can talk right here. Kirkland bristled. He's trying to make this a spectacle, he spat, He's not cooperating. Charles's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. I'm cooperating just fine, officer. The only spectacle here is your attempt to cover up what you did. The blonde officer shot a wary glance at Kirkland, clearly sensing that things weren't adding up. Maybe we should get a supervisor down here, he suggested. Kirkland's face reddened. We don't need a supervisor, he snapped. We need him in cuffs. The crowd, emboldened by Charles's calm defiance, murmured louder. We saw everything, someone called out. You're the one who should be in cuffs. Another voice chimed in. Call internal affairs. Charles felt a flicker of hope. The truth was on his side, and the people knew it. If you insist on escalating this, Charles said evenly, I suggest you call your supervisor now. It'll save everyone a lot of trouble. The second officer, darker-haired and more composed, nodded. That's probably a good idea, he said, pulling out his radio. Kirkland glared at him but didn't object. As the call for a supervisor went out, the crowd settled into a tense but resolute silence. Charles stood his ground, unwavering. He knew this wasn't just about him, it was about accountability, dignity, and setting an example for a community that deserved better. Tonight, the truth would stand tall. And Charles Dixon, seasoned officer and steadfast citizen, would make sure of it. Kirkland's arrogance was visibly cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. His eyes flicked nervously between Charles, the crowd, and the ever-present camera phones. The moment of absolute control he had sought had slipped through his fingers. Charles stood tall, unwavering, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through years of service. You have a decision to make, Officer Kirkland, Charles said firmly. Keep digging yourself into a deeper hole, or step back and do what's right. One of the younger officers, the blonde one who had initially shown hesitation, spoke up. Maybe we should wait for the supervisor, he suggested, cautiously. His tone was measured but laced with a clear warning. This situation's already escalated enough. Kirkland glared at his colleague, but the cracks in his confidence were impossible to ignore. The crowd's growing restlessness only fueled the tension. Listen to him, the older woman from the crowd called out defiantly. We all saw what happened. You need to stop before you ruin your whole career. More voices echoed her sentiment, emboldened by Charles's composure and the undeniable truth of what had transpired. Charles's voice was low, but resolute. If you keep pushing this, you'll be the one facing charges, Kirkland. Assault, false arrest. You're making this worse for yourself. He gestured slightly to the sea of phones recording every detail. And there's plenty of evidence. Kirkland's face twisted with conflicting emotions, rage, embarrassment, and a flicker of dawning realization. His breathing was heavy, his posture rigid as he fought against the inevitable. The darker-haired officer, clearly more confident than his blonde counterpart, stepped forward decisively. That's enough, he said firmly to Kirkland. We're standing down until the supervisor gets here. Kirkland clenched his jaw but didn't argue. His hand dropped from his belt, though his body remained taut with barely restrained anger. Charles held his ground, sensing the shift. You're doing the right thing, officer, he said to the darker-haired cop. It's never too late to make that choice. The crowd's murmurs softened slightly, tension giving way to cautious relief. The scene remained electric, but the danger of immediate escalation had passed. Kirkland's frustration was palpable, but he knew he'd lost control of the situation. The weight of accountability had finally caught up with him. Charles took a steadying breath, knowing this was far from over. But tonight, he had stood his ground, and more importantly, stood for what was right. And the community had stood with him. In the distance, the wail of a siren signaled the supervisor's approach. Charles remained where he was, calm and resolute, ready to face whatever came next. Kirkland's shoulders sagged ever so slightly as the weight of the moment bore down on him. His arrogance, so fierce just minutes before, now flickered like a dying flame. The crowd's energy was palpable, justice hanging in the air, waiting for his next move. The younger officer took a decisive step forward, speaking with quiet authority. "Danny, that's enough," he said firmly. "We need to stand down." The older officer nodded in agreement, his expression more resolved now. "This isn't a fight worth having, Kirkland." Kirkland's jaw clenched, but he seemed to realize the futility of continuing. His hand fell away from his belt, and the tension in his body loosened, though his face remained flushed with frustration. Charles watched carefully, recognizing the shift. He knew this wasn't just a personal victory, it was a lesson in accountability unfolding before everyone's eyes. "You made the right choice," Charles said quietly, his tone calm but resolute. "We all make mistakes. How we handle them matters." Kirkland's lips pressed into a thin line, but he said nothing. Instead, he took a slow step back, his gaze flickering between Charles, the crowd, and his fellow officers. The decision to retreat was clear. The crowd murmured louder, some clapping softly, others voicing their support for Charles. The older woman who had stood up earlier called out again, her voice proud. "That's right. You did the right thing. Officer Dixon." Charles gave her a small nod of gratitude before turning his attention back to the officers. "You have witnesses here," he said calmly. "People who saw what happened and recorded it. I'll be filing a formal complaint, and I trust the department will handle this appropriately." The darker-haired officer nodded solemnly. "Understood, sir. We'll make sure it's documented properly." Kirkland opened his mouth as if to protest, but the words died on his lips. His backup officers subtly guided him away, steering him toward their cruiser as the crowd began to disperse. Charles stood tall, watching them go, his cheek still faintly stinging but his spirit unbowed. The woman who had spoken out approached him, her expression warm. "You handled that with grace," she said. "Not many people could have done it." "Thank you," Charles said, his voice steady. "It's not about pride. It's about what's right." She nodded approvingly. "The neighborhood saw what happened. We'll have your back if they try anything." As the last of the onlookers drifted away, Charles took a deep breath, the night air cool against his skin. He knew the battle wasn't entirely over. There would be reports, interviews, and perhaps more fallout, but tonight he had stood firm. The street was hushed now, the echoes of tension fading into the cool night air. Charles walked slowly, his breath steady as he took in the quiet aftermath. The slap of shoes against pavement was a reminder of how quickly peace could return when people chose courage over chaos. The older woman lingered nearby, her silhouette illuminated by the streetlights. She approached him again, her voice softer now. "You think they'll let this slide?" Charles shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "No," he said simply, "but I've faced worse. The truth is on our side, and they can't erase that." She smiled, faintly. "Well, you've got witnesses, more people than you'd think willing to back you up. You just showed this neighborhood what it looks like to stand tall. That means something." "It does," Charles agreed. "And it's not just about me. It's about all of us." She extended her hand, weathered yet firm. "Glad I got to see it firsthand." Charles shook her hand warmly, her grip a reminder of shared strength. "Thank you for speaking up," he said earnestly. "It makes a difference." With that, she nodded and walked off, blending back into the rhythm of the neighborhood, now calmer, perhaps a little stronger. As Charles continued his walk, he reflected on the weight of the night's events. Moments like this left scars, but they also planted seeds of awareness, unity, and courage. He passed by familiar landmarks, The corner store with its flickering neon sign, the park where children's laughter still echoed in his memory. These streets held history, stories of triumph and struggle, and tonight had become part of that history. Charles knew the road ahead would have challenges, complaints to file, conversations to navigate, accountability to demand. But there was strength in the stand he had taken, strength in the voices that had risen with him. The breeze brushed against his cheek, a faint reminder of the sting that would fade with time. What wouldn't fade was the resolve rooted deeply in his heart.